are created equal. This bold statement from the Declaration of Independence was revolutionary in 1776. However, at the time, enslaved people were denied the freedoms articulated in our nation's founding documents. I'm Barbara Ham Lee, welcoming you to a special edition of Another View. Today's program, American Ideas, Steadfast Spirits, is a simulcast coming to you on 89.5 WHRV-FM and as a webcast from the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation at history.org/connect. Over the next hour, we'll explore how the ideals of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution affected African American women throughout our nation's history. Has the promise of those founding documents been met? What are your thoughts towards about the path towards freedom and equality experienced by African American women? I hope you'll join this conversation about the roles Black women in history, education, business, and culture have played. Please call 440-2665 or 1-800-940-2240 or tweet, email, or post comments on our Facebook page or chat room. We'll get to your comments in just a few minutes, but first, I'd like to introduce Lydia Broadnax, who was an enslaved woman in the household of George Wythe during the 18th century. Ms. Broadnax gained her freedom in 1787 and went on to run a boarding house in Richmond, Virginia. Colonial Williamsburg historians Tricia and Harvey Bakari are also here to answer your questions. So, Lydia, let me start with you. Now, your owner and the man who let you free later, George Wythe, actually was a signer of the Declaration of Independence.
Yes.
You read the document. So what did you think?
Well, the words were lovely, weren't they? You've already said all men are created equal.
Did you believe that?
Truths to be said. Well, of course I believe that, Ms. Barbara. All men are created equal. I think that inherently everybody knows that. But I don't know that the document itself really meant that the way that we're talking about. It's really interesting when we talk about that document. I remember when Mr. Jefferson sent the draft to Mr. Wythe. My former master, Mr. Wythe, was a dear friend of Mr. Jefferson's and his teacher. Mm-hmm. And that first draft he allowed me to read, and everything that you already know about the document was in there. That beautiful language at the beginning, and then it goes on to talk about the grievances against the king. Mm-hmm. And there's this section towards the end that said, he has waged cruel war against human nature itself.
When you say that, you close your eyes. You can see the pain still.
Of course.
Your thoughts behind that?
It is unnatural to be enslaved. And the fact that these men were talking about freedom and equality and liberty while holding slaves, most of them did hold slaves.
Tricia Brooks, as a historian in here in today in 2013, it is so hard for us to think about the idea of the Founding Fathers saying all men are created equal while their slaves were serving them, right, while they were actually writing this document.
It seems to us to be this huge contradiction, but people viewed enslaved people and African Americans in a different way. And so for them, it was the way of life. It was natural to them to hold people in a state of slavery. But the enslaved people did hear the conversations that were going on, did hear this talk of Enlightenment ideas that people are natural born to freedom, and had always felt that way for themselves. So hearing those things, the enslaved people saw.
So Harvey Bakari, the enslaved people then, they really thought with this document that they would have a chance at becoming free?
Well, they, in the Boston Petition of 1777, which was 6 months after the Declaration of Independence, they said that we have in common with all other men the natural and unalienable rights bestowed upon us by the great parent of the universe. So they were making it known to the Founding Fathers of the hypocrisy of the movement, but they had to do it in a very diplomatic way, of course. And the Founding Fathers, they had worked out in the Virginia Bill of Rights before the Declaration of Independence, how were they going to say that all men are created equal? So what they decided, they had to compromise, because originally it was all men are born free and equal, or something to that manner. But in Virginia, you're born into slavery. So slave masters didn't want that. So eventually they came up with this idea that in the Virginia Bill of Rights that all men are equally free, and I think it's like equally free, and they have certain rights when they enter into a state of society. And that was the way that they could exclude African Americans, Native Americans, women, and others, because you would have to first enter that state of society in order to reap the benefits of those rights.
Well, we are so lucky because we have Lydia Broadnax with us here today, speaking from the 18th century perspective. But before we continue, let's take a moment to talk a little bit about Lydia's life. Documentation and details about the lives of 18th century African Americans are somewhat rare. Tax records, census reports, deeds, and wills provide most of what we know about Lydia, and her story is remarkable. She was an enslaved woman who eventually gained her freedom and went on to become a relatively successful businesswoman. Lydia, tell us what it was like to be free at the time when most of your brethren were enslaved.
When I finally had that paper in my hand, that manumission paper that said I was free, I was overwhelmed with joy. But then in that same moment, that joy was colored by the fact that I knew that so many of my brothers and sisters were still in bondage. So many of the people that I had even worked with at Mr. With's home did not receive their freedom. So my freedom being a gift and something that I treasure and value, it does not take anything away from the fact that there are so many others that still live in bondage.
I'm curious though, were they happy for you? The other enslaved people, were they happy that you got your freedom?
They were certainly happy for me. They hugged on me and kissed on me and were very, very happy that I received my freedom. But through my tears of joy, it was also tears of pain that they did not have their freedom, and there was nothing that I could do.
People are joining us through the chat room. I know you probably don't know what that is, Lydia.
I know what a chat is. Spending time with you, Ms. Barbara.
And that's exactly what we're doing, having a chat. But I want to go to Sharon, who asked, Sharon Lavender Ward asks, did free blacks have to carry papers with them all the time to prove their free status? And were they believed? Did you have to carry papers?
I don't carry them when I'm tending to my day-to-day business. When I'm tending to, I go to Mr. With's home. I care for him, I still work for him, but I have my own home. In places where I am known, I do not need to carry my papers. If I go anywhere where I am not known, then yes, I will keep my papers with me because it is a very precarious situation to be in as a free black person in our time.
Harvey, let me ask you, was there a class system between freed blacks and enslaved blacks?
There were some upper class, if you will, or elite free blacks. However, there was a lot of communication between free blacks and the enslaved community. Because free blacks, like Lydia knew, she was never really truly free as long as her people were enslaved. Because she, like any free black, was vulnerable to being kidnapped and sold into slavery, and it would be her word against someone else, the person who sold them into slavery. So, and free blacks were looked upon as a menace to society. In essence, because many whites thought that free blacks would help blacks in rebellions. And so in 1816, they formed the American Colonization Society to try to rid the country of people like Lydia, of all free blacks, either pushing them exporting them outside of the United States to Liberia, or finding another territory in the United States.
Lydia, what did you think about that? And then I'll bring you right in, Tricia. What did you think about people trying to send you away?
Oh, that is so ugly. I was born here. I live here. This is my home. We have built this country. Where are we supposed to go? What are we to do? What, are we supposed to go to some wilderness and begin again? I'd say that's fine if they give us the money that we're owed for all the free labor that we've done in this country.
Oh, a little feisty were we?
I don't mean to be ugly, Miss Barbara. It's just to hear Mr. Harvey say this about them wanting to send us away.
Yeah, and I understand that. Tricia, you wanted to add something before I ask this next question.
Well, I was just going to add that Lydia may have received her freedom from slavery, but free blacks were still subject to laws that restricted and regulated their movement. They were not permitted to testify against white people in court. They were not permitted to own weapons, which at this time in history was a significant part of your personal protection and also service in the militia. They were not permitted to, of course, to vote and hold office. So even though people were freed from slavery or were born free, there were blacks who were born free, they're still subject to quite a lot of restrictions.
440-2665 or 1-800-940-2240 are the numbers to call if you're listening to our conversation. We are doing a special edition of Another View, so give us a call. Let us know the questions that you may have for Lydia, who was an enslaved woman, became free, or any of our historians here at Colonial Williamsburg. We have a question from L. Price 3, wanting to know, and Tricia, I'm sending this to you, is there any evidence that women believe that not only racial but gender barriers could be broken by leaving the U.S.?
By leaving the U.S.? Well, I will say that in a later time period, moving into the 19th century, there's a woman named Mary Ann Shadd Cary, who was born in Delaware and was very active in the Underground Railroad and moved to Canada. She married a Canadian man and moved to Canada and was an advocate of moving to Canada. And with her moved several other African Americans. And there she was able to start a paper. She was the first African American woman to publish a paper in North America. So.
Good. I want to ask you, in George's house, well, first of all, tell us what it was like to be his slave, and then once you became free, was it any different, or did you continue to do the same job, feel the same?
I continued to do the same work when I received my freedom, but I was getting paid for the work that I was doing, so that gave it a different flavor and dimension, that is to be certain. I was housekeeper for Mr. With, starting in 1765, helping him, and particularly Mrs. With the running of the household, which involved every aspect of the household you can think of. From the, I always would tell people that sometimes I'm working with Mrs. With the books, and sometimes I'm with Betty in the laundry, and sometimes I'm with Hannah in the kitchen. There's a lot of work that goes into keeping a household going.
But when you became free, Mr. With had to take care of you, did he not?
Well, yes, the law says that if you are over 45, which I was, then your former master has to care for you. So I say we cared for each other. He freed me a few days after Mrs. With passed away, so he was definitely in a state of grief. And as was I. I'd worked with and for the woman for over 30 years. So I'd say we cared for each other. Our relationship, 30 years in the making, had become almost like a family relationship, which might be difficult for some people to hear.
I was wondering, so did some people actually think that you may have had a relationship with him?
With Mr. With?
Well, I guess so.
No,
way.
Nothing like that.
Nothing like that.
He's not the type of man that I would be looking for, Miss Barbara.
And we shall chat about your love life later, okay? We have a call from Bunny in St. Augustine, Florida. Hi, Bunny, you're in the air. Hello?
Hello?
Hello, Bunny, you're in the air. How are you?
Yes, I'm here.
Yes. What is your question, please?
My question was, did Lydia hire or own slaves in her boarding house, and how was she able to acquire the boarding house?
Okay, we will get that answer. Lydia, you did actually purchase property.
Yes.
And you ran a boarding house. How did that come about?
Well, as I've already stated, I started working for Mr. With for money, and he also helped me to purchase my home in Richmond. It is on 5th and Lee Street in Richmond, Virginia. So he did help me, but I also had my own money. I'd also been earning my own money when I was enslaved, hiring myself out to do some different things. Mr. and Mrs. With allowed that. No, I do not own any people, and I would never own any people. But I do provide space for free blacks and sometimes enslaved people that are hired out to the city. Now, there certainly are free black people that do own others, but I do not.
How common was it for blacks to own land, Harvey?
To own land?
To own land, to own property, and then we'll go to the slaves from there.
Okay. There were quite a few free blacks that were landowners, particularly after the American Revolution. One of the rewards, if you will, for some of the veterans of the Revolutionary War is that they were given land. So you do have those type of landowners. But But also in terms of slave owners, one reason why free blacks own slaves is because as early as the 1600s, Anthony Johnson, who was an African, owned a few white indentured servants. And the Virginia lawmakers didn't like the idea of Africans or people of Indian ancestry owning white servants. So they passed a law saying that you could not, Negro, mulatto, and this is the terminology used at that time, Negro, mulatto, or Indian could not own a white Christian servant. So if a free black like Lydia or any of her contemporaries at that time wanted to own a servant, they had to be a person of color.
Had to be a person of color. Go ahead.
In addition, in 1782, laws change in Virginia that allow masters to free their slaves, and it opens things up much more for people to become freed from slavery. But as a result of that, the free black population grows. And that's a threat to the white population. And so in 1806, a law is passed that if you are freed, you have to leave the state of Virginia. So many free blacks then begin to own blacks because who they're owning are their friends and their relatives. And they're owning them so that they're not in a state of slavery they are literally enslaved to these people, but they're not working in a state of slavery.
Right.
But they can stay here in their home in Virginia.
And, Rachel joins us from California. Hi, Rachel, you're in the air. Rachel, can you hear us?
How many slaves are usually kept in an average household?
Okay. Tricia, you want to take that? Thank you, Rachel.
Well, the average household varies. So many people own slaves, not just the very wealthy. You can have households that have one enslaved person, all the way up to households that have hundreds. And most people in the 18th century, if they have the means to own an enslaved person, they own an enslaved person because that is to their economic benefit. So most slave-owning households own few slaves, maybe in the neighborhood of 5 to 8.
About 4.
About four on average.
Yeah, when you spread everything out.
And the women then became responsible for taking care of all of them, didn't they, Harvey? I mean, in terms of inside the household?
You mean the mistress?
The slave one, yeah.
Yes, the mistress. Many times people focus on the male, the master, and not the role that the mistress is playing in controlling the enslaved population. Not only would she be controlling the other women, but she's controlling other men as well. And so you can imagine the type of force or threats that she would have to use to control. Let's say like Mrs. Randolph has about 24 enslaved people after Mr. Randolph dies. She's in charge of...
She's one has to enforce, do the enforcement. This is a special edition of Another View, coming to you from the studios of the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation. I'm Barbara Ham Lee. What can we learn from the African-American female experience in terms of race, freedom, and equality? We'd like to know what you think, so connect with us on our conversation by calling 440-2665 or 1-800-940-2240, or you can tweet, post comments on our Facebook page or chat room. Now, many of the issues facing African-American women in today's society, including opportunities for economic and political advancement, were also relevant to African-American women in the 19th century. A sampling of quotes from that era reveals just how similar some of those concerns are.
The colored woman feels that woman's cause is one and universal, and the acquirement of her rights will mean the final triumph of all right over might, the supremacy of the moral force of reason and justice, and love in the government of the nations of the earth. Anna J. Cooper, educator, author. And surely nowhere in the world do oppression and persecution based solely on the color of the skin appear more hateful and hideous than in the capital of the United States, because the chasm between the principles upon which this government was founded, in which it still professes to believe, and those which are daily practiced under the protection of the flag yawn so wide and deep. Mary Church Terrell, founding member, NAACP. Clear and insistent is the call to the women of my race today, the call to self-development and to unselfish service. We cannot turn a deaf ear to the cries of the neglected little children, the untrained youth, the aged, and the poor. Mary Burnett Talbert, educator. I am a woman who came from the cotton fields of the South. From there, I was promoted to the wash tub. From there, I was promoted to the cook kitchen. And from there, I promoted myself into the business of manufacturing hair goods and preparations. I have built my own factory on my own ground. Madam C.J. Walker, entrepreneur. The leaders of the race must teach and inspire the masses to become eager and determined to improve, mentally, morally, and spiritually, and to meet the basic requirements of good citizenship. Social integration is a relationship attained as a result of the cultivation of kindred social ideals, interests, and standards. It is a blending process that requires time, understanding, and kindred purposes to achieve. Nanny Helen Burroughs, educator, entrepreneur. The educated Negro woman, the woman of character and culture, is needed in the schoolroom, not only in the kindergarten and in the primary and the secondary school, but she is needed in high school, the academy, and the college. Only those of character and culture can do successful lifting, for she who would mold character must herself possess it. Lucy Craft Laney, educator, entrepreneur.
We hope you're enjoying this special edition of Another View, American Ideas, Steadfast Spirits. Whether you are listening to us on WHRV-FM, watching the webcast on Colonial Williamsburg Connect, or following us on social media, we encourage your participation. What African American women do you believe exemplify the Steadfast Spirit? We'd love to know what you think. Please tweet, email, post comments, or join our chat room. And our phone lines are open. You can call 440-2665 or 1-800-940-2240. Our conversation continues with Lydia Broadnax, Tricia Brooks, and Harvey Bakari. Now, Lydia became a free woman in 1787, but freedom remained elusive for most enslaved African Americans until after the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, was ratified by the states on December 6, 1865. Tricia, what impact did the amendment have on African American communities?
Well, the immediate impact was to free people from the institution of slavery, but the conditions of slavery in many senses still stuck around for many people in the South. Following slavery, people had to find something to do to earn wages, and the occupations that were available to them tended to be those things that had been available as slave labor. And for women, there were some particular challenges in this because many people became sharecroppers. But one of the problems that women faced was that they may have worked in the fields as an enslaved person, but if they are a widowed woman or a single woman, many sharecroppers would not enter into a contract with a woman. So if they did not have a teenage son, or they did not have a male relative, a brother, or something like that, to enter into this agreement, they didn't have the option of being a sharecropper.
In addition to the relationship then between women who had just been freed and the owner and the former owners, what about the relationship, Harvey, between males, black males, and African American females in terms of their relationship now that they were freed? Was it the same as it was during slavery, or did it change?
Well, one thing that happened is that many, particularly with the help of the Freedom Bureau during Reconstruction, many people wanted to make their marriages legitimate. So families that had been separated, there were great efforts to reunite those husbands and wives and children. So relationships were really important. Sometimes we create this stereotype of the African-American family and the father being absent and so forth. But it seems that there were various times when there were more fathers and mothers in the family units. And you can see after Reconstruction, or during Reconstruction, how important those relationships were, that they would seek out their lost loved ones.
Okay, we've got a lot of phone calls, so I'm going to try to get those in as often as possible. Justin joins us from Norfolk. Hi, Justin, you're on the air.
Hi, thank you, Barbara.
Sure.
My question was, I know today there's a lot of health care disparities in America, and I just wonder, back during that time, was it in the economic interest of the people who own slaves to keep them healthy? And then what were the opportunities for health care after people were freed?
Okay, thank you, Justin, for that call. Lydia, I'm going to ask you first, and for those who are listening on radio, we want to remind everyone that you are speaking from Lydia Broadnax's perspective in the 18th century. But my question to you is, did you receive health care?
Yes, several times in Williamsburg, Mr. With Mrs. With usually would take me over to Dr. Galt if I was having any sort of ailment. I think it's definitely in everybody's best interest that everybody's healthy. And now that I am free, I still look to Mr. With to help me find doctors to care for myself.
And so the doctors would take care of, they had no problems taking care of someone who was of a different color than them, because I'm assuming we're talking about white doctors taking care of black people. Is that right?
In many cases, we are talking about white doctors taking care of enslaved African Americans, and it is at the master's discretion, but you also have enslaved African Americans who are practicing medicine, oftentimes traditional types of medicine, traditional medicine that is remembered from African culture.
Okay, so there. Lynn joins us from Virginia Beach. Hi, Lynn, you're on the air.
Yeah, hi. I really enjoy your show, Barbara.
Thank you so much.
I'm now reading a very interesting book. It's a brand new book out. I got it from Amazon for my Kindle, and it's called Runaway. And it is about the Quaker movement in relation to protecting the slaves going from Kentucky up through Ohio. And evidently, Oberlin there was a Quaker community and tried to help. However, there's a fugitive law that was punitive toward Quakers taking away their farms if indeed they aided any of the slaves coming through. And I'm wondering if any of your guests are familiar with that and could talk about it.
Actually, our guest will answer that, and I've also read the book, so it's a wonderful book. But Harvey, we're going to let you handle this.
Yes, the Quakers, first thing is that there were Quakers that owned slaves. There's a stereotype that Quakers didn't own slaves, but some of them did. But many of them did provide education and so forth. But they were severely persecuted, particularly here in Virginia. They were persecuted for being Quakers, number one, but also being persecuted for helping slaves and speaking out against slavery and the slave trade. So it's not unusual that would happen throughout the country, the persecution of the Quakers. But they were also at the forefront of the abolition of the slave trade.
You want to add something,
Well,
Tricia?
and of course, the fugitive slave laws are passed in the 19th century, and that those laws require that that people return runaway slaves. They require that the legal authorities in a particular area seek out runaway slaves and return them to their masters. So you have people who are attempting to help runaway slaves in some of the northern states that have abolished slavery, but the law legally, they must comply with returning.
440-2665 or 1-800-940-2240 are the numbers to call to join our conversation, or you can chat or tweet or go on Facebook or watch us online. Harriet in Newport News joins us now. Hi, Harriet, you're on the air. Hello, Harriet, you're on the air. I'm not sure, did we lose Harriet? Okay. What she wanted to know, Lydia, was why did Mr. With free you?
Because I wouldn't leave him alone about it. I'd been pestering George With about my freedom since before there even was a law on the books that allowed him to free me. That's not something that, why he chose to free me and didn't free some of the others, I still haven't been able to get a good answer out of him for that.
But let me ask you a question, because do you think that partially because you were an educated woman, you learned to read and write, correct?
I did.
Was that part of the reason why you also wanted your freedom, because you had a different perspective, perhaps?
Well, Miss Barbara, I don't mean to be ugly, but it doesn't take reading and writing to know that you deserve to have your freedom. I think that even if I had never read a single word or knew anything about an ABC or a 1, 2, 3, I would have known within myself that the institution of slavery is unnatural. Anybody, by the time they have a bit of sense in their head, knows if they are beholden to another person without any choices, without any ability to make themselves into what they want themselves to be, they know that that is wrong.
Did you fight for others to become free?
I kept my mouth in George Wyth's ear because he has some influence. My hope was that there would be the manumission law that came out in '82, but that law would lead to general emancipation for everybody. Some people have it in them to fight with guns and knives. That's not my way. But I've thought that perhaps if I could stay in Mr. Wyth's ear, because he does know that I'm an intelligent person, he cannot deny my humanity, and he does not think that slavery is something that we should have in this country. Okay. But I knew that if I continued to push on him and his influence, that perhaps it would help everybody else.
You used a word, manumission. I want to ask you about that word, Harvey, because in doing my research, I had never come across that word before.
Yes.
Can you explain exactly what it means?
Manumission means to free your slave here in Virginia in the 18th century. And I want to add about George Wyth. George Wyth was a man of enlightenment, and there were many people after the Revolution who experienced this euphoria of defeating Great Britain. And they felt that slavery was inconsistent with the ideas of the Revolution. And so many people did free their slaves, like Lydia. So she was freed at a time when many people were emancipating their slaves at record numbers. And so I think that was a very important, he probably, I'm sure Mr. Wyth felt the need to do that at that time. But he didn't free them all.
Yeah, which is very interesting, and we'll come back to that point in a little bit. But Lydia, I'm sorry, Tricia, this question is from you, from our chat room. This is from guest 568. How would a family have thrived if a woman has married a free black man and she was still a slave?
Oh, that's a very good question. In 1662, a law is passed in Virginia that the condition of the mother is the condition of the child. So if the mother is a slave, the child is a slave. So if a free black man is married to an enslaved woman and they have children, their children are enslaved. The origin of this law is actually a woman named Elizabeth Key in 1656 sued for her freedom based on the fact that her father was a white man and English law followed the line of inheritance through the father. So she sued for her freedom and won, the freedom of herself and her child. But this made people realize, oh, wait a minute, we're going to have a situation here where if we have slaveholders and other white men who are fathering these children, then they're not going to be slaves, and that's an economic liability. So there was a reversal of law that happened there. Wow. So what happens for a free black man who's married to an enslaved woman, there's an example in Williamsburg of a man named Matthew Ashby who was able to earn enough money to purchase his wife and his children. But then he becomes their master, and this is before 1782, so it's before he is able as a master to freely free his own slaves. He had to petition the governor's council in order to get the freedom of his family.
My goodness. Who stayed, Lydia, at your boarding house? Were they free?
Sometimes free people, and sometimes enslaved people that maybe have been hired out into the city. Now, I've never had a large number of people stay to the house, but between 4 and 5 would stay, and I've served both free blacks and enslaved people.
So you made money, you were able to save. Did you ever want to just run away from Richmond, to just leave?
I always wanted to go to Philadelphia.
Why Philadelphia?
Oh, because the free black population there is the largest in all the then colonies. Back when I first started thinking about it, back in the 70s. But I, working and running my business and everything, I don't know that I will leave Richmond. But that's something that I had thought about. Now I could go if I wanted to.
Absolutely. Let's see. We have a question from guest 252, and the question is, how did enslavement affect the dynamics of the African-American family? You want to oh, Tricia just went, okay, so Tricia, we're going to let you start.
Well, there's so many different ways, but one of them being the issue that we just talked about of a free man being married to an enslaved woman. Of course, marriage is not legal for enslaved people. So that in itself affects the condition of a family when you cannot legally be married. And the reason for that is, as property, your master can do with you what they will. And that means that the master can sell anyone, your spouse, your child. So the condition of enslavement has a huge effect on the family because it resulted in the separation of many families.
You want to add to that, Harvey?
Yeah, I'd like to turn it around a little bit to genealogy, because what does it mean for people today? Because what happened, you can almost break slavery down into two phases. Those who were enslaved in Catholic countries and those who were enslaved in Protestant countries. In Protestant countries, generally, the father is not recognized. Only the mother is recognized. So if you're doing your genealogy, you can find the mother and the children, but you have no idea who's the father. In many of the Catholic countries, they recognized the marriages. They allowed slaves to get married, and they kept very good records. So if you're doing your genealogy, you can find your great-grandfather and your great-grandmother. So depending on which country and which religion is in enslaving your ancestors will have a big effect on your genealogy.
That is fascinating. Well, are there arenas where African American women have still not achieved equality? Is the playing field in 2013 level for all women? We'd like to know what you think. There is still time for your questions and comments, and we encourage you to call right now. Call 440-2665 or 1-800-940-2240, or tweet, post comments, or join our chat room. Today, African American women have become leaders in politics, business, and the arts. Let's take a moment to share some quotes from leaders from the 20th and 21st century.
If we accept and acquiesce in the face of discrimination, we accept the responsibility ourselves and allow those responsible to salve their conscience by believing that they have our acceptance and concurrence. We should, therefore, protest openly everything that smacks of discrimination or slander. Mary McLeod Bethune, founder, Bethune-Cookman University. It was time that Negroes were treated equally with whites, time that they had a decent school, time for the students themselves to do something about it. There wasn't any fear. I just thought, this is your moment. Seize it. Barbara Rose Johns, 16-year-old student activist. I do the very best I can to look upon life with optimism and hope and looking forward to a better day. I think when you say you're happy, you have everything that you need and everything that you want and nothing more to wish for. I haven't reached that stage yet. Rosa Parks, seamstress, activist. Don't be afraid to take risks. You have to recognize that sometimes you will fail, but you have to regard both the successes and failures as learning experiences and always focus on looking forward. Linda R. Gooden, Executive Vice President, Lockheed Martin. One isn't necessarily born with courage, but one is born with potential. Without courage, we cannot practice any other virtue with consistency. We can't be kind, true, merciful, generous, or honest. Maya Angelou, poet. Education is transformational. It changes lives. That is why people work so hard to become educated, and why education has always been the key to the American dream, the force that erases arbitrary divisions of race and class and culture and unlocks every person's God-given potential. Condoleezza Rice, former Secretary of State. I am an example of what is possible when girls from the very beginning of their lives are loved and nurtured by people around them. I was surrounded by extraordinary women in my life who taught me about quiet strength and dignity. Michelle Obama, lawyer, First Lady.
Efforts to overcome the legacy of slavery and discrimination continue to this very day. This is a very complex and often emotional subject that no single program can completely cover. Hopefully, this discussion will encourage you to engage others as you explore the important contributions of African American women in our society. Who do you admire as a steadfast spirit? Our phone lines are open. Call 440-2665 or 1-800-940-2240. If you are following us on social media, please take a moment to share your questions or comments. Our conversation continues with Lydia Broadnax and Colonial Williamsburg historians Tricia and Harvey Bakari. So as we're talking about women today, Tricia, I'm going to ask you to start this segment. Have we come as far as we should?
I think there's still a long way to go. I mean, we have come a very long way, and we do have a legacy of incredible African American women who have been able to bring us forward in making a lot of advances. And one of the final quotes in the last segment had to do with the importance of education. And many African American women who are activists were teachers. And becoming a teacher was a political act in many ways, because people recognized the importance of education and the need to have that educational background in order to be able to speak for yourself, stand up for yourself, and protect yourself. To be able to know what's going on around you. Some examples going back to the 18th century, conducting business, I'm sure for Lydia Broadnax, being an educated woman and being able to keep business records would help her. So people recognized education, and education today has been an important part of moving things forward for African American women.
And Harvey, you know, Lydia owned a business, and there is a lot of entrepreneurship within the African American females that are going on. I mean, that legacy seems to be continuing.
Yes, you don't really have to tell me much of that because my wife owns a business. and what's really important is that instead of my daughter going to a daycare center, she would go to my wife's job. So she was being nurtured in an environment. She understands what customers are. So at a very early age, and I think that's how history moves on, and Steadfast Spirits moves on from one generation to the other. If you have someone in your family who's engaged in civic activity, in volunteering, or in business, or other forms of engagement, that is a more valuable lesson to a child than if we just talk to them or just read them something out of a book, when they have those examples in their lives. So I think, you know, Steadfast Spirits starts each day with one's mother, grandmother, father, grandfather, child, sister, and brother, because it's not always the people that we see in the history books that make history. Many times it's just what we do every day to make good citizens.
You know, everything comes back to the family. Yeah. I mean, every time we talk about issues, you know, that particularly affect the African American community, it always comes back to the family, and the family being the center point from which people can learn. We have a tweet from one of our viewers says, "For me, Maya Angelou exemplifies the African American women's spirit." You know, what do you think about that?
I think
Tricia?
Maya Angelou is an excellent example of the African American women's spirit. Her poetry, her articulate ability to express such a wide variety of things. She's a wonderful example. There's so many people, when I heard the question, who do you hold as a steadfast spirit, names just start running through my head.
Well, such as?
Oh my God, such as Mary McLeod Bethune, who was an early, very political activist who founded the National Council of Negro Women. And was a member of what was called the Black Cabinet in President Franklin Roosevelt's administration. I think of Ella Baker, who was an activist in the civil rights movement, who was very involved in getting youth. I mean, again, in a sense, going back to the family and the idea that we really have to bring up our youth. I think of all the women who were involved in the National Association of Colored Women. who had the motto of lifting as we climb, an organization that was founded in 1896. And that motto, lifting as we climb, is these are mainly educated, middle-class women who are relatively privileged, but their thinking is, we're coming from this point of privilege, and we are here to bring forward and fight for equality, for women's suffrage, for equality of African Americans. But as we do this, we have to lift the entire African American community with us. Again, many of those women educators.
You know, it's interesting. A few weeks ago on Another View, we did a show about Makers, which is a PBS documentary about the women's movement. And we had 4 African-American makers from Hampton Roads on the show. And one of the questions I asked them was whether or not, particularly in the 70s, they felt that the discrimination that they may have faced was based on race or based on gender. And to a person, they all said gender, which I found interesting. From a man's perspective, Harvey, what do you think about that?
I think that when I look at some of the events in the 60s, that in many cases women were marginalized in the Black Power movement, because part of the Black Power movement was really going all the way back to Frederick Douglass, was black men trying to regain their manhood. And in the process, that was taken away from slavery and Jim Crow. And in the process of trying to regain your manhood of being able to provide for your family, you don't want your wife to have to go out and work. Within that sphere, women got caught up in that as well. So you have the two men, like two bulls, who are clashing, but yet at the same time, they're still trying to maintain these kind of male-dominant themes, if you will.
But I think it's very important to remember that you can't separate race from gender in a lot of ways. As a white woman, there are certain barriers that are put in front of a white woman. For an African-American woman, there may be some of the barriers that are the same, but race interacts with gender. And I think what Harvey just said is a great example of that, because you have a situation where you have African-American men trying to reassert themselves in a society that sees men as the ones who are supposed to be dominant, and women who are supposed to be good and pure and stay in the realm of the home. And so what is the impact on an African-American woman who has to go out and work? So what is the cultural view of her? Becomes very different than the cultural view of a white woman, whom both may be oppressed, but some of the factors that an African-American woman are dealing with have to do with race and her gender interacting with each other.
Lydia, I would like to ask you a question, because we're talking about a long time since you passed away, even. Oh, gosh. But we're glad you're here with us. Yes, eventually we all are. But we have an African-American woman who is First Lady. What do you think about that?
Who's she married to?
She's married to an African-American man.
Well, how about that?
What do you think about that, Lydia? Could you ever imagine in your lifetime that at some point in time in this country that would happen?
I think that maybe I imagined it, but I didn't know that that's where we were headed. It gives me hope to know that is where we are headed. But just meeting Miss Tricia here has given me hope, and meeting you has given me hope to see that that's where we are headed. That the work of what we are doing today in the early 19th century is going to lead to more women having their own businesses. And my goodness, a black woman who's the
She's the
wife
lady,
of the
absolutely.
black president, my goodness. I don't know what to say.
Makes you excited,
It does, I don't know what to say.
We're getting in more tweets. Oprah Winfrey, Rosa Parks, Condoleezza Rice being named as Steadfast Spirits. Why do you think in the African-American community it is those names, those people resonate so well in terms of giving people the impetus to keep moving forward? I
think because everybody needs a model. It's like the old song, everybody's looking for a hero. Everyone needs someone to look up to. And whether male or female, you need that model, because it was a dream for Lydia to think about a first lady and an African-American president, but you have to have that model, so it makes it easier for the next generation to think that they can accomplish it.
And I also think Rosa Parks was one of the names you mentioned, and I think of all of the things that came before Rosa Parks that enabled her to take the action that she took, not getting up from her seat, taking that action at the right time in the right place to turn it into an action that could really bring us forward. But it's something that others did before her. 1884, Ida Wells Barnett did the same thing, essentially, on a Chesapeake and Ohio train car, and was physically removed from the car and sued and won. And then the case was appealed. They offered her money to drop the case. She said on principle she wasn't going to do that, and she lost the appeal. But 1884, she did that. 1904, Maggie Lena Walker was one of the leaders of the Richmond streetcar boycott when they segregated streetcars in Richmond. So all of these people are coming. Irene Morgan in Virginia, the Supreme Court case Morgan versus Virginia, which desegregates interstate transportation. So all of these women are people we can look back to. Rosa Parks had those women to look back to when taking the action that she took.
What do you think that young women today in the African American community, if they don't look back to the Rosa Parks, but who are they looking at today as their steadfast spirit? Who are some of the people you think they may be looking
contemporary
at?
people?
Who are contemporary?
Well, I
yes.
certainly think Oprah Winfrey, who was mentioned, is one of them. Michelle Obama is definitely one of them that I think many people look to. And there are women who are entrepreneurs and business women who, in very public ways in the music industry. And I think people look to them. They have been very successful and are able to essentially run a business through the music industry or through entire banks in fashion. So I think there are a number of women now.
Lydia, let me ask you a question. What happened to your home? Do you know?
Well, it is my intention that I will be buried at my home, and that it will go to my sister's grandsons, Philip and Benjamin. I would like for them to have it.
Okay. Harvey, what happened to Lydia's home, actually?
Well, in her last will and testament, she did include her nephews and her sister in the last will and testament in Richmond.
There was a time, Lydia, where you had to reach out to Mr. Jefferson, to Thomas Jefferson, to ask for some help. Can you tell us a little bit about that? What was going on?
Oh, surely. Shortly after Mr. Wythe passed away, which is, we could have a whole hour-long conversation about the conditions of his passing, I found myself on some difficult times. Mr. Wythe interceded for me several times in my business life and helped me. And I was just having a rough time, and my eyesight was failing me. And, Mr. Jefferson, who really kind of owed me a few favors from the time that that he lived with, at the Wythe house. Mr. and Mrs. Wythe were away. But anyway, this was back in the 70s, back in 76 that he lived at the house, and we developed a bit of a relationship. And so I said, well, Mr. President, I'm going to write you a letter.
And he actually wound up helping you, didn't he?
Yes, he did. He sent me $50 so I could get some eyeglasses.
We were talking about role models in 2013. Did you have a role model?
Well, I felt like we created ourselves as role models for one another. Some of the other enslaved people in the city, my dear friend Eve and Aggie and Agnes and all of the other people, we modeled for each other what we could be. I always also looked up to my mother. She was the cook for Mr. Wythe back at his mother's place, his mother and father's place in Chesterville. And she just always had a grace and a dignity that I always looked up to.
So, final thoughts, because we've got about 2.5 minutes left. I'll start with you, Harvey Bakari, historian here at Colonial Williamsburg. Final thoughts on Steadfast Spirits.
Well, Steadfast Spirits, I think it's important. It's an important topic to look at the role that people play. But I always like to emphasize that it's not the big events, it's the small events. It's the ones that don't necessarily make the history books that are just as important as the ones that do make the history books. And, you know, certain events, whether it's the Montgomery boycott or the civil rights movement, become a catalyst for others to be able to redefine what it is to be American.
Okay. Tricia Brooks, who's also a historian here at Colonial Williamsburg, your final thoughts for the audience.
Well, of course, as a historian, I spend a lot of my time thinking about our history and how it impacts us today. But I think it's very important for us as a nation to look at and understand our history, to understand the roots of our nation in a time, the nation being founded in a time when slavery was prevalent, because that helps us to understand how we got to where we are today. If we don't understand that legacy, we can't understand where we are today. And the same, I think, is true when looking at this long history of African American women who, whether they are the ones Harvey just mentioned as being important, the ones who you may never have heard of, or they are the women whose names we all know, Rosa Parks, Oprah Winfrey, looking at them and understanding what their contribution was and how it brought us forward to where we are today.
Okay. And Miss Lydia, you have the last word, and you got about 15 seconds.
Value your freedom, and don't forget about us.
And don't forget about you in terms of...
Don't forget about us. Those of us who were enslaved, those of us who tried to make a way for ourselves in the midst of a climate that was not very helpful in us trying to make a way for ourselves.
Okay. I want you guys to know that we've also gotten comments from listeners and viewers and so forth who talked about what a wonderful panel you all have been. So thank you so much for that. You've been able to make history come alive for us, and so we really appreciate that, and I know we have a lot of other things that will be going on. And Miss Lydia, I hope I did not offend you by saying that Mr. With and you had a relationship.
Of course not, Miss Barbara. You couldn't offend me. No. Well, we did have a relationship, just not anything that was scandalous. I'd say by the end of his life, we were close friends.
Okay. And that's all the time we have for today's program. My thanks to Katrinah Lewis, who portrayed Lydia Broadnax, Colonial Williamsburg historians Patricia Brooks and Harvey Bakari, and to all of you for participating in American Ideas Steadfast Spirits. If you would like to learn more about this subject, here is some information about Colonial Williamsburg's Steadfast Spirits Weekend.
The Steadfast Spirits Weekend will focus on exploring various different ways that African American women during the time of the Revolution were able to exercise some control over their lives in spite of the fact that they lived in a society that oppressed them both for their gender as well as for their race. We can see how these women with so much going against them were able to make these great strides forward that we have benefited from today in order to help others reach the fulfillment of the promises that the Declaration of Independence and Constitution put forward for equality for all.
You can make and get out of this experience what you want, what you need. You can relax, or if you want to get really intense, you could shape this weekend the way you want. Create the experience you want. We're just providing for you the environment, the experiences for you to get out of it what you feel is important.
And I will host a question and answer session with guest artist Erica Hubbard on Saturday, March 9th at 3 p.m. in the Kimball Theater in Williamsburg. I sure hope you'll join me. For now, thank you for joining me for this special edition of Another View, a co-production of WHRV-FM and the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation. Colonial Williamsburg is a center for American history and citizenship, advancing the understanding of America's founding principles. Over the next few weeks, I hope you'll continue to explore the Connect website and encourage your friends and family to participate on the blog. And I hope you'll join me every Friday at noon on 89.5 WHRV-FM for Another View, where we discuss the issues and celebrate the successes of the African American community. My name is Barbara Ham Lee for WHRV-FM and Colonial Williamsburg Connect. Have a wonderful weekend, everyone. So now we just sit and chat.